Thank you to Asia Society for inviting me here today. What an honor and pleasure it is to share this next half hour, an hour with you together with Andy. Of course, being someone in the East Asian department, I'm delighted that in the audience today are you language teachers, my colleagues in many ways I run into in the hallways, but never get to interact enough with. And it just so happens that in many ways I think of this book as an homage to all the envoys, ambassadors, and diplomats of teaching Chinese language on the ground, from 16th century Jesuit missionaries to our current day language teachers. So I thank you for, in some ways, indoctrinating or initiating our students into this very exciting field, but of course, also very fraught field of study at the moment. So when I think of the Chinese language, I really think of languages in general, how Walter Ong, who was a scholar on media and technology, wrote that writing really is the first technology for humankind. It is a way of objectifying our thoughts, putting outside of our own head, which we can then refine and exchange and pass on to posterity. And we think of it so little now because it is second nature, if not primary nature to us, to have a native tongue. Right, to be a native speaker, to have a mother tongue, to be a native speaker of a language, which is almost the same as our identity, how we communicate, how we express ourselves, how we even organize our own thoughts. But then when you look at it historically in the Chinese context, especially in the 20th century, and how China came under the greatest challenges in the era of its language, it's really quite extraordinary to realize that there's these three very important principles or questions that come up. The first is habits of mind, how entrenched they are, how culturally coded they are, and how usually we don't need to be that reflexive about them. The second is first mover's advantage. And the third is the power of standardization. So we start with habits of mind, which I think is also particularly important at the moment when so much of, I think, speaking here in the United States, of course, we're in the throes of perhaps one of the greatest moments of non-communication or miscommunication between two sides. And it's particularly poignant to look historically on this and realize that this is not the first time it's happened. And every time it's happened, it seems we are equally shocked at how the other surprised us. And for China, in this sense, it was first in terms of language. When the 16th century, Matteo Ricci and his colleagues came to China, and the missionaries at the time was really doing this as a favor to themselves. It was not meant to be shared with the Chinese, that they had to figure out how to speak Chinese right away, fit in. And so they Romanized, almost like cheat sheets. They write out how exactly the Chinese would sound, but in alphabet letters. And the Chinese saw this, and they were amazed at how with 26 letters, more or less, you can basically capture all the sounds in Chinese language. Now, of course, many of you know we had the grand old 反切 cross-cut, reverse-cut method, which I'm not sure if many of us know how to use now, and which is you take two characters, and then the way you know they sound, you kind of splice them, and to get the third pronunciation of the character you don't really know. Of course, the problem is sounds drift over time, so pretty soon you have two characters that don't really sound like they're supposed to, and therefore they cannot yield the proper pronunciation for the third either. But when they look at alphabet letters, they saw something different. They saw these fixed sounds that were attached to each of these 26 symbols that could then be recombined to compose any word you want, which is pretty extraordinary. Because think about it, 26 letters, that's not very hard to learn. I think about when I learned English. It took about 6 months to just learn how to write the letters and et cetera, and to ingrain the sound, and so that in my mind, a particular sound is matched only to a particular letter. But then after that, you're kind of done. Whereas, of course, there are tens of thousands of characters. Well, depending on how literary you want to be, there are thousands to tens of thousands of characters that you need to learn. So all this could perhaps still be explained and be accepted culturally. Except in the 20th century, late 19th century, in fact, that's when we started seeing the emergence of the most important change of our time down to this day, global communications. Communications technology like telegraphs, typewriters, computers. None of them was designed for non-alphabetic languages. So there was a more pressing question for the Chinese, which is bound up with questions of national survival, is that if the language doesn't survive, how will China do it in the 20th century? So oddly, in the late 19th century, it was an incredibly open, progressive time, pretty radical, where a number of Chinese language reformers, the very first generation of script reformers, were prepared to jettison the Chinese language altogether. Why do we need characters anyway? Why don't we use Western, the alphabet letters and maybe tweak it a little bit, add a couple more? Or why do we use some other writing system? And this was a period where these script reformers were thinking about, if you don't make Chinese accessible, not just to foreigners, but to its own people, then China would have no future. Because at the time, of course, the education system was on the brink of collapse. The civil exam system was also under question. Young children would spend years and years learning how to write characters instead of thinking in math, learning physics, learning chemistry, learning modern sciences, engineering, what have you. So I thought this was a great impediment, perhaps, at the time, in the 19th century. People also thought it was actually terrible for your health to study Chinese. Exhausting. You look at characters, you're only promoting the rote learning part of your brain. And my gosh, modern life with, lights and glitz, and it's already taxing enough. And on top of that, you still have to learn Chinese the traditional way. And so, if you're in Shanghai at the time, you can buy these brain tonics, these brain tonics. There's a very famous one called, of course, I must say, it's Yale, Y-A-L-E, but that's actually not. That's Yale. It was meant to disguise the Chinese inventor's last name, which meant yellow. So it's brain tonic. People are asking about, maybe Chinese need to eat more red meat. They need to be out in open air more. They need to be more athletic, instead of wasting away learning characters, inside these school grounds. So, all these questions came up, and it seems like Chinese language was being blamed for everything. It was blamed for everything. It was blamed for China being behind everybody else, being backwards. It was blamed for taxing young children's brain and somehow stymieing the process of evolution. And it was blamed for politics, that if the Chinese had been better negotiators, after the Opium War, if they had understood what they were actually reading, right, because the treaty had to be in English, if they had understood what they were signing away, that perhaps they would not have been in dire straits by the time of the last dynasty's collapse, 1910, 1911. So there's a real shift in the early 20th century with this aggressive and also, I think, a broad consensus that something had to be done about reviving the Chinese language. But very early on, soon after the revolution happened, soon after the Republic was founded, it was pretty much out of the question that you would ever abolish the Chinese script, right? So this late 19th century fantasy about, let's just adopt a different kind of writing system altogether, that came to a very quick end. Now, there are still some murmurs throughout 20th century, idealists like Esperantists who still advocate for a different kind of writing system. But pretty much the Chinese decided the Chinese language, the written script, is the heart of its cultural heritage, and it was going to survive at all costs. So then you have these tremendous efforts. Now remember, first half of the 20th century, China was not exactly, a great time for implementing any kind of reform or program or proposal or new language schemes. China was embroiled in revolution after revolution, foreign invasions, war against the Japanese, not to mention civil war, internal strife, the struggle between the nationalists and communists, who actually each came up with their own particular way of Romanizing Chinese, right? So Chinese language very much was always part of politics in early 20th century. And then people are thinking, well, there are kind of two different alternatives, right? You can either just Romanize Chinese and leave it at that, or you figure out something else to do with the Chinese characters themselves. So most of the story that, the big story that we know, the usual story that we know is, yes, Chinese went on this Latinization path, eventually took on pinyin, et cetera, et cetera. But pinyin, along with doing something about characters themselves, were actually always considered to be means to an end. They were meant to be bridge solutions. In other words, it was never the Chinese intent to westernize their script system. Now, as for how to revamp the written Chinese character, that's really something interesting, because you look at it, you're like, okay, we can say it's pictographic maybe, or maybe we think it's more shape-based. So there's a lot of discussion that tried to break these old habits of thinking or looking at Chinese, right? That it might have been pictographic, that there's something, that was actually something, there was some kind of sanctity attached to the way that it was passed down to us. That there's only one part that you can kind of look at in isolation, which is called the radical every character. But other than that, the kind of everything else follows rules. Even the way you write it, calligraphy has to be a certain kind of order progression, right? So the Chinese language, as with the culture itself, was always very, very past conscious, right? Very much oriented towards a tradition, what it inherited. Of course, 20th century is full of rebels and mavericks. And one of my favorite characters, who also happens to be one of the, probably still the most well-known bilingual Chinese-American writers, Lin Yutang, many of you know. I came across him when I was working on a completely different book, and I was only interested in him at the time as a writer. And then I discovered, what at least I never knew before, that he had a deeper passion to invent the Chinese typewriter, a Chinese language typewriter. And he almost ruined his career from doing so. He spent all his royalties on this. You know, he was so passionate about it, and he kept it kind of secret for a long time. He studied it for decades before he actually unveiled his Chinese language typewriter. Now, at the time, of course, this was my book for tenure at Yale, so I couldn't exactly take a great digression. So I bookmarked that in 2010 to come back to it. And he figures quite prominently in this book. And one thing that Lin Yutang did that was considered rebellious was oddly presented in this one particular article that seemed very boring. It was just called library science. Library cataloging. Now, what's odd is this article appeared in the same issue of, you guys might remember Xin Qingnian, right? La Jeunesse, which is the most important journal, modern journal founded by young Chinese intellectuals to talk about new ideas, revolution, radical ideas, anything that's Western. So it's right there alongside all these more radical ideas like Henri Bergson's, his philosophy of life. So library science is not exactly a sexy topic at the time. But there, Lin Yutang presented his opening salvo. He basically said, what if we look at the character differently? For once, don't go by the radicals per se, but also think how characters can be isolated as components in different ways. So he drops this quiet bomb and then goes off to get his degree in Germany. But of course, it left everybody else kind of wondering, maybe Lin Yutang's onto something. So while Lin Yutang was out gallivanting, becoming a public writer, intellectual in the West for the next 20 years or so, there were scores of Chinese inside China who began this character index race, right? That is to say, coming up with a system that could use Chinese language itself as a kind of organizational system, kind of like the alphabet. So to give an example, obviously when you look up a word in a dictionary, like Webster's or something, it's very simple, right? Everything's alphabetically arranged because that organization comes with the alphabet itself. B comes after A, S always before T. There are no real surprises. Now, this is actually immensely powerful because it cuts out a lot of transaction costs in accessing information. You only need one step to look up a word in English. I probably don't have to tell any of you in the audience what's it like to look up a Chinese character in a Chinese dictionary. See, that tells me you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it is already so much simpler now than it was before because there were 7 steps, 8 steps if you're lucky, and sometimes still ends up being the wrong character. So everything was very cumbersome. So people took to the idea of Lin Yutang and said, okay, what if we look at Chinese characters as made up of parts that can be reorganized or at least referenced like ABCs. Now, this became very important when you get to the keyboard era, because it turns out, by one study, if you type on the Chinese keyboard, of which, if you're in China, there's like a dozen different ways of inputting Chinese into a computer, right? Only here in the United States, we get basically pinging, most because it comes with iPhone. If you're like me, I'm completely dependent on that, right? But there are different ways of doing this on Chinese keyboard. Many of you know, like Wubi and all these other different input methods. But if you look at that keyboard, what they essentially did was they mapped character parts onto the keyboard. Now, if you ever wonder, now you will know when you leave here how that happened. Because Lin Yutang actually came back in the 20s and 30s. And throughout the 20s and 30s, he basically mapped that initial idea he had onto an English keyboard to create his Chinese typewriter. So it turns out if you try to type a Chinese character on this keyboard, a Chinese character can be broken down by Lin Yutang's logic into what averages out to be 2 to 4 parts, which means it only takes 2 to 4 keystrokes to type a Chinese character, to compose a Chinese character. Whereas the English word, the length is actually closer to 5. So what's odd is you can actually type out Chinese faster on the English keyboard than English. Now, what's extraordinary about this, and I'm kind of compressing a very important period, 70s, actually starting in the 50s, but more aggressively in the 70s throughout the 80s. This period of history where they basically tried to map Chinese characters onto keyboards. Many of you might have lived through this in the 80s. And this period was very important because it essentially kind of adapted Chinese to the Western keyboard, but then also in some ways enhanced the Western keyboard for Chinese use, right? And this, in many ways, I hope in the back of your mind, you're hearing almost a very familiar story that we hear reported in the media these days, which is about how Chinese leapfrogged using Western technology, how they might have, in some ways, mastered it all too well. Now, during this period, it also happened that, in the 70s, so this is a period right before market reforms, early 80s. This 70s period, which kind of spans the end of the Cultural Revolution and into the preparatory period for the market reform. You cannot imagine the kind of stories, what people had to do to get themselves there, to get themselves ready. So there's a particular project called 784. And this particular project was designed to be Chinese language, to tackle Chinese language processing. Now, extraordinarily, this is really the first example and the first experiment where China was drawing together institutions, universities, scientific institutes that were actually with the ministry, right? So government and civilian units working together to try to get a handle on Chinese language processing. And you might wonder why, because after the Cultural Revolution, there were hardly cars, let alone computers. Like, why were they so obsessed with this? Well, that's when the story takes us across the Pacific to Silicon Valley. Because at the time, Silicon Valley was coming out with PCs, they were moving out of the mainframe computing era, and really there was a huge market, right? Huge market to profit from in delivering a desktop, back then it was still desktop, to every household. And they were eyeing China, right, in Asia. And of course, there was Japan also in the picture, in Korea, but of course, China used the greatest number of Chinese characters, so the innovation that Japan came up with in encoding their characters or their kanji was not all that useful for China because it couldn't scale up as easily. And so China realized it had something that the West wanted very badly, which was access to its language. And so there was actually a handwritten letter from Jiang Zemin because he had to review these proposals coming out from the United States, basically companies, one based in Belmont, Massachusetts, that wanted to partner up with MIT, and they wanted to propose basically building the first Chinese computer, Chinese language keyboard computer. And he said, it seems like we have a great asset on our hands, and we shouldn't let the Western firms get an edge on this. Better that we develop it on our own. So this is a particular wonderful story that I love, also because it was this period where there was not really formal exchange, right, between China and the United States, not until Nixon's visit. But there were these trickles of scholarly exchange that was happening. I'm happy to say between scholars like myself, although back then more like scientists, who would just go to China, these study groups, they're taken around, kind of like the way we have conferences now, these people-to-people exchange that seems so rare these days. And they exchanged information. They exchanged their research. And what mattered was that the MIT proposal for Chinese language keyboard, what they did not know was that it actually took reference from Lin Yutang's keyboard, which by that time had kind of spread and abroad, because Lin Yutang was abroad. In fact, when Lin Yutang had his computer, there was this one very poignant episode. He describes that he took the computer, it was raining that day. He actually lived on the Upper East Side. He had an apartment on the Upper East Side, or maybe it's Upper West Side. And he had it under his arm, and he took it to do a demo for Remington. His daughter was his typist. You could hear a pin drop in the room. It was so exciting, right? All the CEOs, heads were sitting around this oblong-shaped table. They pressed the key and nothing happened. Like, it was a total debacle. It's total debacle. Lin Yutang was very disappointed, but he's like, okay. But he basically ended up selling his keyboard technology with a keyboard layout to Mercantile. I think at the time it was like 25 grand. Not very much, $25,000. But then it was during the Cold War, so this keyboard was taken over. The United States Air Force, the research unit, took a great interest in cracking the Chinese code, right? Because it's Cold War, lots of espionage, cryptography, trying to intercept Russian languages, but Chinese was also a strategic language. So they were interested in that. So they took it over, handed it over to a man named Gilbert King at IBM, who then unveiled the Sino-writer. And the Sino-writer then made its way to this MIT group, who took an interest in developing the Chinese typewriter, or Chinese keyboard, computer keyboard. Now, this is already a very kind of, torture story, a very complicated tale. It's almost like a detective story. But I want to just tell you one thing. That was a very surprise finding when I traced this history. At every point, there was a Chinese in the room that was not acknowledged, right? That Gilbert King had a collaborator, a Chinese scientist who was with IBM for at least 25 years. I didn't have any luck tracking him down because his family was not willing to talk to me in the climate that we're in, understandably. Also at MIT, the invention of the Sinotype is often credited to Samuel Caldwell, who was a professor at MIT. But when he didn't know Chinese, by the way, didn't speak Chinese or know Chinese. But when he was first brought in and given this task, given this proposal, there was one other person in the room that was not really mentioned in the public literature thereafter. This young mainland Chinese PhD student, Francis Lee, who knew Chinese. And he was actually tasked with finding out how feasible was this going to be, because Caldwell didn't know Chinese. And so Francis ended up helping him with this, if you trace all this, of course, he knew about Lin Yitang's proposal, the library index, the keyboard, how to parse Chinese characters in ways that would make it usable for keyboard, right, for Western keyboard. So this story throughout sort of went back and forth across the Pacific, but it's very much lost in the past several decades, partly because it became kind of a triumphant story, because the United States wanted to be the one to crack the Chinese code. In fact, this proposal went as high up as under Eisenhower, but then they kind of figure out that how amazing would it be, right? Kind of, in some ways, beat the Chinese to the punch if the United States can say, oh, guess what? We invented a Chinese computer. But it never quite happened because I wasn't sure how scalable it was, how feasible it was, how solid the research was. So actually you can see the internal memo at the Eisenhower Library where it's kind of shelved. And so Eisenhower never made that public announcement, which is probably good because he might have been very humiliated. So, these stories about the Trans-Pacific Exchange is always swept under the rug, I think because of present memory, right? The kind of story we want to tell about the United States and China right now is one of polar opposites, right? Enemies standing on different sides of the line. And we don't want to acknowledge these moments of very fruitful collaboration that were critical to the advancement of not just both sides, science, technology on both sides, but also the history of humankind. Like think about how Chinese computing now, what they're working towards. If there were any collaborative opportunities, where that would take us. But I also want to say at the same time, because of the current climate we're in, we're also concerned about precisely what we've seen in the history of Chinese script revolution, which was the power and the importance of standardization. It is important to develop a technological milieu that is on your terms, right? Imagine if in the late 19th century, telegraphy, and then later typewriters, later computers, were not developed for the Western alphabet, but in Chinese characters. Like how would the alphabetic world, the Western alphabetic world, what would they have to do to adapt to this infrastructure, right? I'll leave you with that question because I think it's always nice, it's always important when we get a lesson in history where we have to put ourselves in the other's shoes and try to think about the paths not taken, what could have been, and the what ifs. So I'm going to leave it at that also because I want to have plenty of time for my friend Andy Browne, who I haven't seen since the Olympics. So Andy will have some interesting stories, but you can be sure I'm going to pry a story or two from his own language learning the next half hour. Andy.
Jing. I can attest to the fact that learning Chinese is in fact bad for your health. I never had to wear glasses until I started looking up Chinese characters in a dictionary and counting the strokes, right? So it's a real honor. The last time we were together on a stage was in Beijing at the NBC coverage of the 2022 Winter Olympics. And our job was to be cultural interpreters, cultural bridges.
I think I had the easy job. I think you had to deal with all the thorny political issues as a journalist, right? At least I always point to say that way.
Right, so this was the division of labor that Jing got to talk about Chinese language, Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese civilization, and I got to talk about all the bad stuff, right? But we were threading a needle. It was tough. It was tricky, right?
Yeah, that certainly was.
So let me go back to the book. You talk about rebels and mavericks, and the rebels and mavericks are all the characters that populate your book and really bring this book to life. And it's kind of an interesting contradiction because these rebels and mavericks had actually dedicated themselves to, one might say, a conservative cause, which is to preserve Chinese culture, tradition, civilization through the language. How do we think about that?
But to preserve a tradition that's on the brink of extinction, which is how they felt, that was radical, right? That actually took a lot of guts. When you think about, at this time, there was no state sponsorship. They didn't really get help. I mean, one of my favorite late 19th century script reformers died a pauper at the tender age of 28. And he was basically hanging out in tea houses and teaching his system to anyone who would listen. So they were Mavericks in many ways, but I think they were also I think most of these characters are, if you meet them in real life now, it's not someone you want to have as your office mate or colleague. They're for sure obsessive, stubborn, very quirky, probably socially awkward, right? And always, almost invariably, grumpy old men. It's very hard to find a woman in this history.
So we were talking about this earlier. You have this pen portrait of a French count who found himself, a linguist, who found himself in a Chinese jail, mutilated. But upon his release was instrumental in the development of the Chinese telegraph.
Yes, that's actually, I'm so glad you brought him up, because this is actually one of my favorite characters, but he didn't get as much coverage just because at the end, when you look at a book as a whole, you start killing your darlings, as they say in the publishing world. And Count Esterhazy, which was his name, was with the Anglo-French expedition to China, which concluded the Second Opium War. And he was part of this expedition. He asked to be on it. He came before the British Academy and actually requested to be embedded in their scientific research expedition team. And he was captured. And word had it that he was in this, urine-soaked, these hay-covered cells, mud cells, and that he was mutilated. Now, there were some questions as to what kind of mutilation it was. There's a couple of sources that suggest he was castrated, which might be a little bit, might be
it's definitely bad for your health. I mean,
very bad for your health, detrimental. But also because he had his hands tied behind his back. There's also some accounts of them becoming so swollen that, in fact, after he was released, he lost the use of his hands. So the memoirs, he wrote very voluminous memoirs of his time in China afterwards. It was dictated. Someone else wrote it down for him. And it's odd that, after an experience like that, you would think that you would want to have nothing to do with China again, never hear of it. But perhaps in that cell, he had this idea that maybe if Chinese were part, you can bring China into the fold of world civilization, like by virtue of opening up channels of communication, like telegraph, that maybe this kind of thing wouldn't happen. Because he was an adventurer. Like, he traveled, China was one of his last stops, but he hung out a lot in the Middle East, in Sudan and other places. He used to be recorded as he would walk around Paris when he's back home, dressed as captains, kind of like Lawrence of Arabia or Indiana Jones. And people always thought he was a very odd character. I mean, all the characters in the book are odd. If you really think about it, I mean, who else would dedicate their entire life to do something in some ways so without immediate payoff as a Chinese script system? And so but instead, he came up with this very esoteric system of locating Chinese using this kind of this table or graph. You can isolate parts of the Chinese character and then in this tabular form. It was a very odd one-off system and actually didn't have too much impact on the later telegraphic code system that came into use. But he is the first one to come up with that system.
So what motivated people like him? Love of Chinese culture, the technological challenge?
I think it's really all the above. It's an odd thing because it was not just, you think of Chinese language, reform, you think, oh yeah, it must have been a sort of internal affair. But it wasn't like that at all. You have Chinese, you have Westerners, you have native speakers, you have non-native speakers who are obsessed with cracking the Chinese code. To different purposes, obviously, right? Because the Chinese wanted to save their language. They wanted the characters to continue living and sort of trying to figure out how to negotiate alphabetic milieu. And for Westerners, about how to get into China, right? How to get into the minds of the Chinese. But their purposes dovetailed at certain points, right? They intersected in very important ways. So it's almost like a collaborative effort, even though neither side will probably acknowledge that very readily. But I have to say, in terms of what drove them to want to study Chinese language, Andy, what made you study the Chinese language in the first place? I'm not sure if I ever asked you about this.
What motivated me to study Chinese? Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I can never remember a time when I haven't been around Chinese dictionaries and the study of Chinese.
That's because your family.
Right. So I'm English, and my parents moved to Hong Kong in 1960 when I was 2, and my sister was 4, to become missionaries. They were evangelical Christian missionaries, and the first 2 years of my life was spent on Chengzhou Island in Hong Kong, while they tried to master Cantonese, which of course is even more complicated than Putonghua. Six tones, right? And that was, and then we moved to Shatin Tongluan, and I went to Chinese school, and I grew up in a Chinese village, and I grew up speaking Cantonese. And I have to say, it was the greatest gift my parents ever gave to me. Language has been the key, honestly, the Chinese language has been the key to almost every important thing I have done in life. I mean, from getting a degree to getting a job, even getting married, buying my first home in Beijing, building a house in Beijing. You can't do that without speaking Chinese, by the way.
You certainly have to haggle very seriously.
You have to haggle. Selling a house in Beijing. So yeah, it's always been part of my life, and my own kids, they grew up in China, in Beijing, Shanghai. And like most parents, including Chinese parents, the agonies of trying to convince them that learning Chinese is going to be the best thing that they can do for their future.
That's very prescient.
Yeah, I used to lecture. I said, listen, if you're going to go for a job interview at some point, they're going to say, oh, where did you grow up? And you say, well, I grew up in Shanghai and Beijing. And I said, the next question is, how is your Chinese? Right? And if you can't tell them my Chinese is fluent, what could be your greatest strength actually turns into your biggest weakness, right? What if this person lived all this time in, I used to say that, and they took it to heart. And it's true. Chinese language has been key in their life too.
Yeah, it's really odd when I listen to you, and I think that, what would draw, obviously having grown up in Taiwan and then coming to the States when I was 9, what would bring the two of us from such vastly different backgrounds to be here talking now about this? Because for you, it's kind of having been embedded in the Chinese community from a very young age, and for me, it's actually having been extracted, as it were, right, from my native context into a kind of alphabetic one. And I wonder how that colors our different perspectives, right? How that changes how we look at Chinese culture and how we relate to that language and its mentality. Did you ever think in Chinese? I was going to ask you the same question. I don't think I thought in Chinese, but I definitely have Chinese habits of thought that I don't feel ever really that I fit in as a Brit in England or a Brit in America. I definitely think that there are certain cultural habits, certain cultural constructs, ways of dealing with people, ways of looking at life that have been shaped by language and living in Asia. I mean, I lived 50 years of my life in basically Chinese societies, right? Yeah, that's always the question, is like try to separate out the ways of thinking from the language itself. Because of course, there's also the problem of getting into essentializing the Chinese mind, right? That somehow you really think fundamentally different in Chinese as you would in an alphabetic language. In fact, neuroscientists in recent years, since 2006 or so, have been working in this area, the science of reading, right, which is kind of a niche in neuroscience, where they actually, these two neuroscientists that I tracked down, one in Paris, one here in the States, were working precisely on this question. And independent of one another, they presented similar results. Which, as it turns out, whether you learn something phonetically or graphically, as you would Chinese, primarily graphically or primarily phonetically, because Chinese is both, of course, as with English. English is also shape-based. It doesn't really matter in the end, because your neural networks kind of makes up for it. Mm-hmm. So there's always kind of a tricky thing, trying to find that cultural residue, right, that explains. Because we always want that. We feel as though this is a way to explain our difference so that difference will go away. Or we want to say, no, there is that difference that will never go away, and therefore keep our identity as something distinct. And to tell the truth, I'm still kind of on the fence about it. I mean, it's kind of the question of essentializing. Maybe there's a combination of both, as with all truths, right, somewhere in between. I don't know.
Do you think in Chinese or in English?
It's odd. When I think emotively, I think in Chinese. Well, definitely when I count in Chinese. Who wouldn't? It's so much faster.
Right.
But when I think, obviously, if I'm giving a lecture in English, I'll be making my notes in English, but sometimes shorthand.
At what stage in your adventure in life, when you left Taiwan, came to the US, at what stage did you feel that linguistically you'd made a leap from thinking, writing, studying, speaking in Chinese to this culture?
Rather late. I would say college, actually, Nantou College. I think partly because my mother kept a lot of Chinese books around the house after we came, and she also schooled us. She continued our Chinese education. It's really kind of odd to think about, 在家里背唐诗or 写作文, 练毛笔字. I mean, it's like things that you probably wouldn't do in school anymore. My mother had a very, she gave us a very traditional kind of curriculum. So, we memorized the 三字经, and, we did the calligraphy. So there's always kind of like a very, at home, was always immersed in that. And I'm very grateful for that, because my parents are also the ones who, my father taught me how to read Wenyan, like literary Chinese. And so, I remember him holding my hand, teaching me how to write calligraphy. And so these are very formative experiences. But I think, having been in the United States, when I was in college, I think in college was the time when I really had to do a mind shift, because that's also when you're trained to, to engage in critical thinking and understanding what that is. And that particular kind of operation, like being very critical and also being like kind of almost like logical, like almost like mathematical, that was something that I did not find, that did not come readily to me if I were thinking in Chinese. Right? Because the kind of Chinese that I was not accustomed to thinking in, it was also the very kind of westernized kind. Where modern Chinese is a lot like that. There's a lot of grammatical properties that were imported from Western grammatology. Tenses are all more regulated than before. In fact, these days, you can basically run it through Google Translate probably and have it come out pretty coherent. But that was not the kind of Chinese that I was taught at home necessarily. We're also kind of like, also coming out of a Taiwan background, it's also you're more well versed, you're much more exposed to the traditional writings and style of writing. But yeah, the idea of becoming like critical thinking, I could feel at the time that I had to cut off a part of my brain in order to learn to think how to think critically, coldly. It felt to me like it felt kind of cold. It was not something that lent itself to kind of natural, intuitive feel. But to this day, when I read Chinese poetry, I need to read it in traditional characters. Not even simplified, but traditional characters. And in general, I read Chinese faster than I do in English. Like, I don't know if you do this, 有时候你就眼睛一照, like one page, you can kind of figure out what's on that page. For some reason, you just kind of know whether it's going to be like more about scenery, more descriptive, or more like this and that. But with English, I can't quite do that. So even though when you read in English, you also don't read letter for letter, right? It's also kind of like you spot read it.
I'm assuming Kingdom of Characters has been translated into Chinese?
I just saw the Chinese translation, actually. It's still sitting in my inbox. I have to review it. Should I? Part of me's like, just... They probably did a good job, or maybe they took some things out. But if they did,
you should check for that, for sure.
Well, there's not a whole lot I can do about that if they were to do that, since that does happen quite frequently. But it's also coming out in translation in Taiwan, so it's coming out in both versions.
What reactions, feedback have you had from readers, Chinese readers, American readers, to the book?
Surprisingly positive. Also because this book is really about, it's about doing justice to the human characters behind every written character they sought to save and to preserve. And so, I was not writing with geopolitics in mind, even though, as I explained to you, it turns out if you look historically, you basically fill in the background of current geopolitics in a very important way. And so it's been actually very positive, even in China. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But to tell the truth, I didn't know what to expect with this book. This book is in many ways kind of like the product of the inventors I talk about in the book. It was kind of an odd thing that, I partnered up with a young literary agent, Elias Altman, and we pitched this to a number of publishers in New York. And we thought, at the time he said, Jing, maybe we could get 2 bids or 3, that'll be pretty good if we get 2. And we had 13, 14 callbacks in a period of 2 days. And it was so exciting in some ways. And by the end of the first day, I kind of thought, okay, someone's got to take this. So I remember I was standing at a crosswalk, an intersection down in Chelsea somewhere with Elias. And he turned to me and he said, I don't know if I told you this, but you're going to be my first solo sale. I was like, I'm so glad you didn't tell me that before I went in. But, just very much in the spirit of the book itself. We also went with Riverhead, who never published a book on China before, but there was this team of just like tinkers and mavericks. And when I met them, even though we met with others who have done this kind of book before, zillions of times, I just thought this felt right. This book is about these adventurers and mavericks and people who fell out of history. They're not the martyrs or revolutionaries that we commemorate, nor were they the little people that we sympathize with. These were kind of I call them the second and third stringers of history, who decide to go against the tide. And they did it in these small ways. And many of them didn't live to see the fruits of their labor. And of course, history technology goes, your labor, the most successful labor is the one that completely disappears, right? Because it becomes completely integrated into the next stage of technology. So it kind of felt right. It's just everybody just kind of very much do-it-yourself kind of spirit. So I didn't really expect, or I didn't think beyond just finishing the book, which took COVID to do.
So just to loop back to where we started, obviously language is the ultimate cultural bridge. But tragically, it's also been at the center of so much of US-China tensions. One thinks about these big, divisive debates about Confucius Institutes. One could even include actually issues around US choking off semiconductor sales to China, which hobble their ability to build computers and generate computer language and advance the economy. But in a sense, listening to what you were just saying, it's sort of 'twas ever thus, right? You talk about Lin Yutang and his typewriter and how Remington basically came in. I think in the book you made more of a case that Remington had sort of tried to suppress this as some kind of a competitive commercial.
Well, actually, surprisingly, when you're in the tech industry, you're not really you're not governed by identity issues. You're just thinking about, is this thing going to work? And so it's actually very unemotional in the sense that nationalism comes second, innovation comes first. At least that has been the case. And so very much were they suppressing it? It was actually, at every turn, it was a very pragmatic decision. This is going to cost too much. It's not going to mass scale readily, right? Like, where are you going to find the parts? Like, how many users are we going to have? So it's rather kind of unsentimental, and which is also why I thought it was important to write this story, because a lot of choices that were made that had these political connotations, and that reach into identity issues, decision making was quite unsentimental.
What's the sequel to Kingdom of Characters?
Interesting to see sequel, because it does have something to do with the future. I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, you can't tease us like that. You have to.
I love teasing you, Andy.
Give us a clue.
Well, I think it's going to focus more the past 70 years of engagement, also but more science and tech focused. But I hope to preserve all the good parts of our kingdom, because I really do think, I wrote Kingdom of Characters, the world was not as it is now. It was at the beginning of, I think, the current climate, but not quite as it is now. And I do feel that it's important to provide a different kind of perspective. That's one that's not beholden to policy making, or the military, or even journalism, or even pure academia. So that's what I hope to do in the next book.
We look forward to the sequel. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been a real privilege, a real pleasure. Thank you, Jing.
What a delight to see you again, Andy.